This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of African Drums, a presentation of the Coffee 250 Committee. Today, our conversation is on the African Village Movement and its place or its role in the development of Guyana's socioeconomic culture and society. Before we go into the program proper, I just wanted, as usual, to read for you a statement prepared by the Coffee 250 Committee. In our multi-ethnic society, with its inevitable competition for resources and the insecurities that flow from that competition, it is a mistake to ignore the inter-ethnic dynamics. Our national quest for social, economic, and political justice is situated in this basic challenge, yet that quest rings hollow if we ignore the relationship between nurturing the overarching national community and addressing the conditions, desires, and interests of its constituent ethnic groups. After all, in the process of competition, narratives of defense and offense are constructed by groups, and these form the basis for the power relationships which follow. What often emerges is the myth of innate ethnic inferiority or superiority, which, depending on the balance of power, becomes social truisms that direct action by and towards ethnic groups. One such myth in Guyana is the inferior instincts for commerce and less than sterling contributions of African Guyanese to the evolution of the Guyanese economy. How often have we heard that African Guyanese cannot do business, or that the emancipated Africans abandoned the sugar industry in the wake of emancipation, or that widespread poverty in the African Guyanese community is a result of laziness and preference for shallow materialism. What about the charges of economic marginalization of African Guyanese and the counter-charges of economic equality? One prominent political leader asserted some 2 decades ago that African Guyanese are at the bottom of the economic ladder. Was this true then? If so, is it still true today? Are African Guyanese at the bottom of the economic ladder? How has the structural adjustment program of the last three decades impacted on the African Guyanese community? If we accept that all is not well economically with African Guyanese, what should or can be done to repair the situation? We in the Coffee 250 Committee believe that the answers should or can come from the questions of what contributions have Africans made to the socioeconomic development of Guyana. The quest is to help ignite a drive in the African Guyanese community towards socioeconomic and cultural revitalization. Today, or rather tonight, I am joined in studio by Mr. Greenidge, MP, and Mr. Vincent Alexander, social activist, as we discuss the African Village Movement and the development of the socio-economic society we call Guyana. Welcome, Mr. Greenidge. Welcome, Mr. Alexander.
Thank you very much. Happy to be able to join you.
And I'd be very happy to have you too. Of course, you two are very distinguished. Mr. Greenidge is a member of Parliament, as many of you know, for the Alliance for the Partnership for National Unity. And Mr. Alexander is no stranger to us. He is a social activist, former politician, I suppose.
Quite correct.
And the Registrar of the University of Guyana. Gentlemen, considering the African Village movement and the early success, what would you say has been the impact of the African Village movement on the Guyanese economy? Whoever wants to start is okay.
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me say that in the immediate post-emancipation period, you had the emergence of the so-called African Village movement. The question that you put isn't one that one could perhaps answer in a sentence or two, because it's a process. You're asking not what happened immediately after, but you're almost asking for an interpretation of the history of the post-slavery period. What I would say to you is this, that the reaction of the Africans who had emerged from the slave plantations is an exercise that has to be understood as complicated. First of all, whilst the Africans set about trying to rid themselves of the racial and legal oppression that faced them after the abolition of slavery, the colonial powers, the colonial office on the one hand, the planters on the other hand, were themselves pursuing their own goals, and you had subsequently the, if you like, injection of indentured labor into the process. And when you come to the period of independence, there are another set of changes. So the question has to be one that is perhaps could best be made manageable by looking at specific periods. Immediately after the abolition of slavery, the drive and the attempt that the African villages were pursuing was really to establish an arrangement in which they could sell their labor to whoever wanted to buy that labor in a manner that would maximize the income they could get from the labor. Okay, so you had a market in labor out there. It was very limited, mostly for skilled and semi-skilled labor during the slavery period. Of course, almost by definition, unskilled labor was largely under the heel of the plantations. Now, with the abolition, slaves would apparently be free to sell their labor and to get the best prices that were available. But in fact, across this country, the plantation owners sought by various devices to force that labor, forced Africans to sell their labor at depressed prices onto the markets to the various plantations. And they did this by a variety of devices, including social devices, such as restricting their access to facilities in the villages. You got in the case of Essequibo and West Dema, even the flooding of estates, the flooding of the estates that the slaves would have themselves acquired. In this way, destroying the alternatives to plantation activity. So one of the things they faced was an attempt to deny them economic activities and to force them to sell their labor to the plantations. So the emergence of the village movement, a process by which villages got together, bought themselves land, and much of that land was in the form of plantations, which they would have had to operate as plantations because they were, by and large, many of them were indivisible. You can't irrigate or drain 1/10 of a plantation. You have to do it in its entirety. It's what is called an a public good. One seawall or one set of embankments and empouldering would serve for a large area, and you have to operate that area as a whole. So they were faced by a number of challenges as they went on. What the initial reaction showed was that even under pretty adverse circumstances, if you could work together, you could find institutional arrangements that would enable you to pursue economic activities that could help you achieve the ends that you set about. But I mean, there were a number of challenges, and this is why I'm saying to you it's a complicated story, because you would have, for example, people from the East Bank of the Essequibo and from West Dem who would try to avoid being lent on by the plantation owners in that area. And a significant number of the people who settled on the East Coast, who eventually settled on the East Coast, were actually laborers that would come, African laborers that would come from West Dem, East Bank, Essequibo, to find work on the plantations of the East Coast, which was perhaps the most vibrant of the plantation areas at that time. And in that way, they would appear before plantation owners who didn't know them individually and couldn't press their children or their wives or whatever. And you would have a relatively free labor market. And that is how you had quite a lot of movement. From that part, after working over this site for 4 or 5 years, people eventually settled here and started to buy cottages or small bits of land so that they could be closer to their workplace. But that is part of a process. Perhaps the greatest impact that that initial phase had wasn't only the process of adjustment, but it had the consequence, I believe, of forcing many of the laborers to seek opportunities outside of the agricultural area, because it seemed very often that the cards were stacked against them. You had villages, you set up the villages, you worked with the villages, but all the way along you had problems. The big exits, of course, came 1885 to 1883 to 85 when you had the collapse of sugar prices. You had it again in 1894 to 97. You had another perhaps even bigger collapse of the sugar industry across the Caribbean, especially in Guyana, and at the time even flight out of the country to Suriname and elsewhere. It has always been a process by which, or an exercise in which they've been forced to adjust and adapt. And that has been one of the phenomena you see in African behavior in respect of the economy. But that's perhaps the briefest I can make it. I don't want to speak too long.
That's okay. Mr. Alexander, do you have anything to add?
Well, certainly. I think, first of all, we must underline the fact that the Africans purchased those villages. And it speaks to, response to one of the myths about the Africans' inability to accumulate, to be frugal. The fact that they could have purchased those villages suggests that they had the ability and they did exercise it and were able to save to purchase those villages. So that's the first myth I think the movement itself seeks to dispel, if one looks at it from a historical perspective. Secondly, I think that the village movement was important for the creation of community, because here were ex-slaves who were living on plantations, whose lives were highly regulated by the plantation owners, who by virtue of the acquisition of villages and moving into that space were able to create natural communities. And I say natural communities because very often when one talks about local governance, one could see physical space being determined by the state, the drawing boundaries and declaring areas to be of a certain level of local governance. But in the case of the ex-slaves, they purchased villages themselves and were not subject to artificial demarcations of their interaction. It was a voluntary interaction of people in a particular space in which they chose to have that interaction. And that led to the creation of community. The whole question of identity, the whole question of belonging. And that has indeed lived on. Because when you talk about whether it's Buxton or Victoria or Anne's Grove, it is from that origin that you really have this even present feeling of community and belonging. And this had to be something of import, because prior to that they belonged to someone, and now they could have a physical space and belong to community that was their own. So I think it's very, very important in terms of what the village movement did for the African Guyanese. But the village movement itself was the victim of a number of things. And the community which I just referred to, coming out of the village movement, had to respond to those things in various ways. And I would say that the manner of response is reflected in the kind of occupations that the African Guyanese subsequently became involved in. And it speaks again to another myth, that they weren't good farmers. The fact of the matter is that because the plantation owners wanted to retain their labor in the plantation, and because of the nature of the drainage and irrigation systems in Guyana, be it on the East Coast or West Demerara, wherever it was, those who control the irrigation system could affect anyone else, and the irrigation systems were not controlled by the villages, so they were affected. They were not able to get involved in the kind of agriculture that they initially wanted to become involved in, and that was an attempt to force them back onto the plantations at cheap rates. And so you saw them moving out into mining, and you saw them aspiring to move into services, be it the police service at some stage, be it the civil service at large. And so what happened to the village movement, in a sense, defined the occupations that African Guyanese then followed, and to a large extent, even today, are still following. And this is not because of anything innate in them, it's because of the social and economic circumstances that they had to respond to that has caused this evolution of occupational tendencies. I would say also the village movement represented another word. The first word I used was community. But I would say the village movement also is intended to represent liberation. You know, to come off the plantation is one thing, but to be tied to the plantation by virtue of having to seek employment there and there alone meant that they still were not fully liberated from an economic perspective. And so the opportunities that they saw in the village movement, in terms of being able to do their own farming, being able to exchange goods among themselves, represented an effort at liberation. So I would say that the village movement, again, was an important stage in our history in terms of that desire for liberation. We know what the African slaves did, the various rebellions they had in an attempt to liberate themselves from oppression, from slavery. And here again in the village movement, we saw this representing another attempt at liberating themselves from being subjected to the plantation system and being able to bargain with the plantation, even for employment, so to bargain their wages and things like that. But we saw again where that was affected by the importation of indentured laborers and the way they were again oppressed, and that, as I said earlier, led them to do a number of other things in terms of the occupational tendencies. So if one looks at the Guyana today, there's a lot that could be explained by the village movement and what happened to the village movement and what African Guyanese had to do in response to the reality of the village movement. But significantly, it also tells us that there are lots of myths about the abilities of African Guyanese, because what they did then dispelled the myths that there are innate qualities of inability to save and things of that nature. So I think it's very, very important for us, in fact, to study the village movement and what evolved from the village movement if we are to understand the whole evolution of the involvement of African Guyanese in the wider Guyanese society.
There was some success, though, from the village movement, and that's what you're saying. And particularly, if we can zero in the success in terms of the actual production, I think one historian said that by 1841, Africans were trading provisions and were making a profit of $1,000, which was tremendous at that time. And therefore, the economic activity of the community, that, as you described the African village at the time, the economic activity seemed to have been significant, and therefore that had an impact also. I know that you both spoke just about the response of the plantocracy. Some historians have also suggested that they sort of created a buffer group, because now these freed Africans, the African ancestors or African ancestors, were able to sell to the large economy the surplus provisions and stuff like that from the village. How do you describe the response of other groups in the society to that early economic success, that very early economic success?
Well, I find perhaps it a little challenging the way you cast it. The Africans at the time when slavery was abolished would have constituted over 90% of the population. And if they are involved in agricultural production, clearly their outputs would have been significant. So you don't have to establish that. You know, whether they made a profit of 10,000 or 100,000 is actually immaterial. The thing is that these were groups in the country that operated outside of the plantation. They were involved in ground provisions, fruit and veg, and a number of other areas, as well as in crafts, because at the time of the abolition of slavery, and especially under the so-called period of indentureship, you had many Africans, you had some that were freed already, you had many that were actually already the craftsmen on the plantations. The abolition served to allow a number of them to move to the towns to practice their crafts so that they could be freed from the oppression of the plantations. But the general question you ask about, so the economic activities were, they were moving into a widening range of economic activities, and the places and the direction in which they moved was to seek to get the best returns from their labor. As far as the markets were concerned, the markets in which they operated were not protected markets, but again, it depends on what period you're speaking about. As you come into the 20th century, the nature of the market changed. As you come into the First World War, you got problems of difficulty getting imported flowers, so you get greater expansion in the markets for ground provisions, for example. Access to salted cod, salt fish, again, would have been restricted. The same thing happened in the Second World War. These periods led to a boost in the demand for the products that the African villages would have been producing, and in that way gave a boost and made it more profitable for them. But the reaction of the other groups I've signaled already, certainly the plantations, the planters, would have been the main group, but remember, this is a complex society. If you see Weber, for those that be in bondage, which was written in 1905, 1907, you will see that this is a society that had many strata. And when you ask about the other groups, whereas in 1850, you would have had basically Africans, you start to get some Chinese and Portuguese. By the time you get to 1920, it's a far wider group and more competitors. But the the thing was this: you bring in labor so as to try to depress the wages, and that labor also included Barbadian labor. They also were bringing in Barbadians as you move towards the end of the century, Africans from Barbados to cut cane. And the intention here was to keep the market rates at a depressed stage, because at a variety of points, including in the early 1840s, you got efforts by the laborers to get together to negotiate wages, to get better wages than were in existence. In fact, there was a case in which the magistrates had to pronounce on these attempts because the planters regarded this as treasonable, with all the usual consequences. You had problems in Essequibo too. So that was the group that mattered. In the immediate aftermath of the abolition, the group of consequence was the planters. You have attorneys working for them. You have a variety of others. But as you move towards 1860, by which time you start to get a large and significant group of Portuguese that moved off the estates, and the English gave them preferment in terms of ability to get licenses, to open shops, to be operating in the gold mining areas, and to buy and sell gold. The point, I think, of import is that the system as a whole, the colonial regime, favored other groups outside of agriculture, and put barriers in the way of Africans to get into these areas, which many of them would have been seeking to get. And the other groups often, of course, took advantage of the group that appeared to be and was in fact disadvantaged. And that's how you eventually ended up with some of the social reactions that you had, the Angel Gabriel riots and the other riots against other groups that Africans felt were taking advantage of them, exploiting them, or were abusing them. And that is something that marked the period right into the 20th century. By 1905, of course, they, whilst there were tensions with Indians on the plantations, you got opportunities for them to work together. And you had major strikes involving Africans and Indians separately and jointly in efforts to improve their wage situations and wage conditions. By the time you jump to the early 1930s, you had riots that swept the whole of the Caribbean, and these were riots that were the consequence of economic depression, which the whole region was undergoing. And those riots in the 1930s, some of the most serious in the Caribbean as a whole, involved Africans and others in agriculture and out of agriculture. The areas that they'd moved into then would include the dock workers, which was critical in organizing on the waterfront workers and others, forestry workers and so forth. So it's been the case that others have reacted in different ways, depending on the periods. At one stage, the reaction of one group, essentially the planters, was entirely defensive and aggressive towards African aspirations. As the century evolved, you got those who were competitors as indentured people being able to move out, and this would be primarily the Portuguese and the Chinese. And in that operation, you see some of them even moving into local government politics in areas right into the 1940s along the East Coast and elsewhere. Some famous events involving Portuguese, for example, who settled in some of the main rural towns, including places like Plaisance, and controlling in significant ways the economic activities in those areas, which would have been predominantly African. The same thing to some extent you would have had in a place like New Amsterdam. So you have both conflict and collaboration, depending on which group you're looking at. depending on what time period you look at. You're covering a wide time span, so I think that is difficult to give you a definitive answer in that sense.
But I think you've done a great job, Mr. Alexander.
Yeah, I think that one should bear in mind that it wasn't a free-for-all for the freed slaves in terms of the space they were allowed to occupy. And here I'm not talking about the geographicness of the space, I'm talking about the activities that they were able to be engaged in. Because even as you talk about agriculture, when you look at the manner in which the indentured Indians were settled and the access, the almost immediate access that they had to land, they never became what one may be referred to as a pure working class who were primarily or only selling their labor to the estates. They from the very inception, were given some access to land and were able to be involved in peasant kind of activities. And what that would have meant was that they weren't that much of a market for the products, because some of what they were going to consume, they were producing for themselves. So the way in which other groups came along and the space given to other groups for economic activities, in a sense also inhibited the growth of the African in terms of the economic activities that they were engaged in. I think that also should be observed. Now, for example, we talk about the role of the ground provision, and we see the growth of the rice industry and the consumption of rice more in the first instance, by one group than the entire society, in terms of what was the staple and therefore affecting the market for things like ground provision. So that one has to see that complexity of what was evolving in terms of what space was available. Also, one had to see the way in which the state structures started to emerge. Because with the emergence of the state structures, the villages were subjected to taxes, roads and bridge taxes in the first instance. Now, the indentures did not have to be subjected to those taxes. They were living on the estates. They were given land for settlement and agricultural purposes to some extent, but wasn't subjected to the taxes that the African villages were subjected to. So again, you could see not a very homogeneous society emerging, rather heterogeneous, not only because of ethnicity, but because of the way in which they settled and the regimes under which they settled. The regimes weren't quite the same. And as Carl correctly said, you had the Portuguese and the Chinese moving out from the rural areas into the urban areas under, again, different regimes and different kind of facilitation. So that, in a sense, the survival of the Africans could only be called heroic, given all the disadvantages that they were faced with, starting off from the psychological disadvantage of being enslaved and all of the economic and other disadvantages that followed upon them being able to free themselves from slavery.
Perhaps I should add to a point that Vincent has made that warrants perhaps a little bit more careful mention. Of course, these societies that the British set up in the Caribbean and the other Europeans set up in the Caribbean were marked by division of labor by race, and the importation of Chinese, Portuguese, and other laborers, Indians, into Guyana compounded it. The point that should be made in relation to land is that the village movement, 2 points I want to make in relation to land. The village movement, in the process by which villagers saved money prior to the abolition of slavery, because a lot of the monies that were used to purchase the villages, in the Backlist, Victoria, wherever, had actually been accumulated during the period of apprenticeship, where They saved their monies over a considerable period of time, whether they got the monies as gifts or in reward for things that they'd done, or as some of the craftsmen, they used the money to purchase villages collectively in the face of attempts by the administration to force them out of buying the villages by making the plots they could buy so large that they wouldn't be able to afford it. That was one of the tricks. You had to buy minimum. They implemented legislation that required you to buy a minimum size plot, which was a plantation. Okay, and of course, it becomes difficult. On the other hand, from the early years, as soon as the indenture period finished for the Chinese, they put in place arrangements for the establishment, the administration, local administration, put in place arrangements for the establishment of what were called land settlement schemes or colonization schemes. The first one being at Hope Town on the Demerara River, Kamui Creek, where a Chinese group was settled there under a Chinese Christian leader. They were given the land free of charge. Some basic work was done. Those Chinese used to produce charcoal and bring it and sell it at Lombard Street, eventually establish their own marketing outlet, which was one of the things the Africans found difficult to do. That eventually collapsed, but just gives you an idea. It was followed then by a host of land settlement schemes, with the exception of Virgin Ujinai, if I remember correctly, all of them being almost exclusively Indian land settlement schemes. In other words, when the end of their indenture arose, is again another complicated story, but in essence, they're being offered land in lieu of a return passage, in that way bringing a device for holding labor and further making permanent the challenge to African wage rates by tying that labor to land now. These are permanents, they're not, you're not looking forward to maybe half of the laborers leaving and a market that was relatively scarce. The emergence of rice is also very important in this regard. The war in particular, First World War and the Second one, but rice had been grown here, contrary to what has been said. The rice was grown here prior to the arrival of Indians. Rice planted with the assistance or in the style that it would have been planted in Louisiana in the southern United States, for example. But as you approached the consequences of the collapse of sugar, the British Colonial Office encouraged the establishment of the rice industry. Some of the land settlement schemes were linked to the rice industry. They weren't mostly successful in that regard for a variety of reasons, some of which they were shared with the Africans. Why some of the villages why some of the villages were impoverished, and why some of the land settlement schemes were impoverished, they had common causes. Some of them had to do with managerial and organizational arrangements in the villages or the land settlement schemes themselves, inadequacies. Some of them, in the case of the Africans, of course, had to do with the way that the British brought the colonial authorities and the local authorities brought pressure to bear on those villages. So again, this is another dimension which influenced the type of activities that emerged and were successful. Because of the support provided to rice, and under the war conditions, the attempt to market it, you had advantages provided to rice by way of a buyer of last resort, grading standards, an export market eventually, and so forth, which never emerged in the case of the non-rice market in the same way. So it was sugar, of course, the best organized of all, with all state support behind it, followed by rice, which was supported by the Ministry of Agriculture and a whole extension service and those sorts of things. You did have a marketing board by the time you got to the post 1930s, which dealt with ground provisions. But it was not really a very effective arrangement, and it didn't serve to boost or to establish standards in the way that was done for rice. It was not comprehensive in its coverage.
Mr. Alexander, in 1970, Guyana was declared a cooperative republic. What was the role of the African village movement in that? And also, how would you describe the economy today?
In 1970, when we were declared a cooperative republic, I think that the then leadership of the country was trying to address the whole question of the socio-economic formation in the face of the post-colonial period. And an attempt was made to look to what had been traditional ways of communities evolving and communities interacting. And so in that regard, the African villages were turned to as a form of cooperative endeavor, because indeed, having purchased the land the way they purchased it and having managed it in the first instance the way they managed it, that was seen to be a cooperative endeavor. And there were ways in which also there was some identification with the Amerindians and the way they operated, that the very communal kind of interaction. And also some of the activities the Indians engaged in where they were working together. So really, the cooperative republic was supposed to be a reflection of the way in which the communities had evolved in terms of internal interaction, and a response to further efforts at liberation, economic liberation, trying to find a path other than the strict capitalist path of development, because that path of development saw us being on the periphery and essentially being exploited by the center, the whole way in which the world economy was organized. And so really what was being attempted was, in some regards, a non-capitalist approach to development, what may be called a local or community approach to development, not exclusive or to the exclusion of some other forms of economic activity, but trying to get the mass of people involved in the community kind of local kind of development that would cause them not to feel the impact of the peripheral state that we were in relation to the capitalist economy. And as I said earlier, the leadership at that time was trying to find some kind of heritage in terms of what we were doing, in the way in which the African Guyanese had related to each other after slavery was abolished, and even the way in which Amerindians were relating to each other, and in some regards also the way in which Indians were related. I think one could even extend that to some of the settlements that Carl talked about, those land development schemes where certain people were encouraged, and the fact of the matter is that as we trace the development of local government, we would see that up until 1994, there were areas that mirrored land development schemes. For example, the Cane Grove area, Virginia, and the Mahike area continued until 1994 to be a land development area. And what is the peculiarity of those areas was they weren't taxed. They were essentially financed by the central government. So similarly, you had the Grove area was up to that time a land development area, and in fact, funny enough, Kokwani became one such land development area as well. So I think that the 1970 was an attempt to find something national that could pull all the strands together, because what we were attempting to do was to create a nation state, I would say, a nation state which may eventually have evolved into a nation. You had to find some commonality that would justify that creation, given the ethnic diversity that had plagued us, had virtually plagued us. And so to find some kind of economic kind of unit that could be associated with all of the various ethnic groups. Bearing in mind that the whole idea of cooperativism was not just the idea of having cooperatives. Of course, that was going to be a crucial unit, economic unit. We talked about a tri-sectoral economy, so cooperatives were going to be alongside the state and alongside private enterprise. But cooperativism was more than that. Cooperativism was an attempt to create a spirit of mutual interaction and mutual cooperation for the benefit of whichever unit it was, whether it was a ministry, whether it was a village, whatever it was. Cooperativism was intended to create an ethos that would, every country has something that drives the country, some ethos. They talk about the American dream. Well, cooperativism was what was supposed to drive us. That spirit of overcoming, of entertaining diversity, but overcoming differences and working together.
Mr. Greenidge, how would you describe the economy today?
Well, let me just add one dimension. The scenario that Vincent has painted as regards cooperatives, I don't have a problem with. I'd like to add, however, that I think that there was a dimension of cooperatism which turned upon the fact that, or needs emphasizing, that this was an attempt to establish socialism, if you like, in the context of Guyana, and it was a major pillar of that drive. And as regards the cooperative, I think the key issue here was a style of management that had to do with the not only the absence of exploitation, but a form of sharing of resources between the different actors. In a sense, cooperatives both succeeded and failed in that area of management. I'm not going to pursue that now. But there's a dimension that was specific to that area that is no longer the case today, as regards hinterland development, the agricultural process, the agricultural thrust, and the era of 1970s and the cooperativism differed from the previous era of land settlement schemes. The land settlement schemes of Hoosterderen and Virgin and those were coastal land settlement schemes. The cooperative drive brought with it a program of hinterland development, extensive hinterland development, in which land settlement programs, wider than schemes, now not schemes specific to an ethnic group, were established off the coast. And you had efforts at transforming Matthews Ridge and Arakaka, Port Kaichuma area into an area in its own right where it would be a center for a range of products that were not typical, not the normal growing provisions. You got turmeric, livestock, and a variety of other things attempted to be produced in that area. You have the attempt to produce potatoes, so-called Solanum potatoes or English potatoes. So you had in that area, as opposed to now, an attempt at agricultural diversification linked to a more widespread use of the space that was available to us, the movement off the coast into the hinterland. And a lot of the PNC's program of the post-70 era had to do with that. And certainly from 70 to 85, a good deal of resources, until we ran into fiscal problem, was intended to push both cooperatives and hinterland development. The post-93 era, of course, is a different era. It is not an era of socialism. It has the current program, political and economic, makes no mention whatsoever of socialism. It has no socialist goals. Growing inequality is a feature of the economic policies here today. And the pursuit, for example, on the agricultural front has been one of the major differences. The allocation of land, sometimes to the exclusion of groups that are not deemed to be supporters of PPP. This is almost unique in our history. This single-minded pursuit of the followers of one political party. So on the agricultural front, you went to a different era altogether, and you are having attempts, for example, at handing out large acreages of land outside of traditional PPP areas to foreigners, such as you see in the case of the Rupununi to Simpson Enterprises for the production of all things astonishingly rice. You have the attempt to hand lands in the Kanji to a Trinidadian enterprise. An MOU was signed in that regard without consulting anyone. So the idea of both corporatism, the involvement of the people in these decisions by way of how lands are allocated, we've moved away from that altogether, and the relative importance of hinterland development in the agricultural arena is something of the past.
Talking about the economy today, I mean, as a young person, what we observe is an almost exclusive absence or presence of a particular group in the in major business in the economy, captains of industry and so on. Why is that so? And what would you say is the presence of African people, the descendants of those persons or ancestors who created the African villages in the economy today?
I would say that one of the unfortunate things about the country and the economy today is that there has been no attempt to address the circumstances of the various groups and to see how policy of the state could respond to those circumstances. But whilst I say there's been no attempt to address the circumstances of the various groups, historically, some groups have had an advantage in terms of their circumstances being in some regards facilitated. And what has happened is that in the present era, there's been an attempt to redress certain areas, redress which affects the African Guyanese more than anyone else. I don't think we pay sufficient attention to the fact that the late Chedi Jagan, prior to 1992 and after 1992, was very, very positive on the point that African Guyanese had administrative power. Now, in a normal state, one would talk about executive, parliamentary, legislative, and judicial power. But here was Jagan going to using another term, administrative power. And by that, what he was really talking about was the people who were actually in the public service, delivering services. And he was saying that Indo-Guyanese and his party and his government was devoid of that power, and therefore set about to address. So what in fact has happened was in a situation where we don't look at the dilemma of the various ethnic groups and try to address those. He looked at the area of dominance of the Africans and saw that as an imbalance that had to be addressed, but not addressing it in a very formal way, not addressing it in the way where it's placed on the table as an issue, how do we solve this problem? Because once he had done that, then he would have had to be holistic in terms of how you solve the problems of others. And so what has happened is that the African Guyanese have been pushed out. And in fact, it is that mechanism, that area that has been used to give the largesse to non-Africans, so the award of contracts and things like that. And that is what, to a large extent, has led to the growth and development of non-African entrepreneurs, because they have been given the advantage, and in various ways, For example, people would tell you if you had to make a decision and you're of one ethnic group and you had to decide to divide the largesse, to whom would you give it? So in the absence of good governance and strict systems of how you operate, with the virtual invasion of those areas of influence and of power, what we've seen is a discriminatory approach to the distribution of the nations, largely to the advantage of some and the disadvantage of others. So that the Africans could only in that circumstance have retrogressed, whilst others have moved forward, both in terms of where they were traditionally and in terms of where they weren't.
Well, let me come back. The original question you're asking about the difference, how the economy is different and the involvement of groups. Let's be clear. Under the British, the jobs and priorities, privileges went either to Creoles, that is first and second generation Englishmen. The control of business in commerce itself, and in that sense, the top positions in the public service were held by Europeans, half Europeans, and those groups that were regarded as privileged. At one stage, you could find the Treasury, the Ministry of Finance, had a significant number of Chinese and various mixtures in the top tiers, whether it's customs or the ministry itself. So that's why I said at the beginning, division of labor has always been a feature of Guyana. You could almost tell a man's ethnicity, you call the type of job, and I will tell you what his ethnicity is likely to be. In commerce, it was the same. The foreign-owned firms of Guyana, whether they be what is the one on what's it called, JP Santos or Betancourt and so forth, they were primarily ran by Portuguese. Essentially, the top jobs they were Portuguese. Bukers itself, as you approached independence, started to train a cadre of Africans and others to take over. So again, you have to see these things in dynamic terms. The post 93 period, however, again, you've had some fairly dramatic change. It is true that you've had, well, let me start with the consequences. If you look around, you will find that as opposed to what was going on in the period under the PNC administration pre-92, when there was an attempt to diversify the economy into more productive areas, you've, in a sense, retrogressed in Guyana. We no longer produce refrigerators. We no longer assemble motor cars or some variants thereof. The production of stereos, manufacturing, the absence of foundries, for example. These are things that have gone. And these were jobs, the significant proportion of which were held by non-Indians. That is perhaps the best way I can put it. These were areas that had opportunities for other groups. You've gone back into a largely trading environment in which, even if you're not careful, you look around, you see ice cream, meat, all sorts of things are being imported, which had not been the case in the period up to 1992. But whilst it is true that Dr. Dragon and his administration have sought to remedy in selective areas, that is, they looked at areas where Indians were not dominant and have sought to remedy them. In many instances, there are reasons why they were not significantly represented. Indians weren't significantly represented, and why they continue to be underrepresented, even though the government has sought to create specially advantageous positions. But the point I want to make is that in the process of trying to remedy that, you've had two sorts of consequences. One is you've destroyed the public service. The caliber and quality of the public service today is far inferior to those at the immediate independence, the immediate post-independence period, and the period inherited by this administration, whether it is of foreign affairs, whether it is the police, the army, or any others. Okay, let me not say any more on the army. As regards the other areas, you have an area such as aeronautics. At the time I returned to Guyana in '74, you could find in the Caribbean, you could almost anticipate the ethnicity of pilots and of aeronautical engineers in this whole region. They would be overwhelmingly Creoles, Spanish or Francophone Creoles, Portuguese, and the others. Guyana was the only place where it was an exception. Whether it's the engineers or whatever, there was a good chance it would have been an African. Today, if you go to the training school that is at Ogle, I think the last picture I saw of trainers there, they had 19, there was one African. So it is almost a complete reversal, and in that sense, Vincent is right. There have been significant years. You see, it is unusual in an economy, and this sense I don't quite agree with Vincent. It is unusual in an economy, or it is not unusual to find groups changing their relative positions. One group dominant, another group in 2 decades later more dominant. However, what is unusual is to find an absolute deterioration of a major group. In other words, the airline industry, the aircraft sector, elsewhere, you would expect that it might be dominated now by Indians as opposed to Africans. But you would not expect to find practically no pilots after a situation in which the bulk were African. You would be surprised. And therefore, policies have to be deliberately pursued for that to have happened. And that is really what has happened in Guyana. And that is what has given rise to so much animosity and antagonism. The government has also, by seeking to undermine or destroy some of the institutions that has served as avenues for the training of those persons in the bureaucracy, in the technical areas, has also undermined the abilities. If you look around, the number of technical training schools outside of Indian areas has declined dramatically. The training schools in Demerara, for example, in Georgetown, they've largely gone. They've largely gone, and that means that the technical skills that would normally come out of the African areas have withered. That is another phenomenon. Wow. In the area of consultancies, for example, you can hardly find agricultural engineers and drainage and irrigation engineers in the public service in Guyana who are of African stock. Many of them had been forced out of the service into the private sector and were doing consultancies. Now, with the corruption, it's not only an ethnic imbalance story. The attempt to remedy the ethnic imbalance by the government in selected areas only has been matched by corruption in all of those areas. So you compound discrimination with theft, the growth of the kleptocracy that people have written about in relation to Guyana. That is also a feature. That's a big difference between the pre-93 period and even the pre-independence period and what is happening today.
So in closing, what's the way forward in just a few words?
Well, I would say in some regards the spirit of the village movement is still required. But the experience of the village movement also have to be looked at, because a lot of the experiences of the village movement are mirrored in terms of what's happening today as well. And therefore, whilst the spirit of the movement is required, rectification based on the experience of what the movement went through is also required.
Mr. Greenidge?
Yes, the African communities themselves, I think, have to look at the circumstances, the institutional arrangements that are required to make them viable communities. They've got to look at those things themselves. The government isn't going to do it. You have to start paying attention to those, paying attention to households, to homes, to values, to the educational mechanisms, formal and informal.
Thank you very much. And this has been African Drums. Join us again, of course, next week, same time, same channel. And look out for information about the West Bank Forum, State of Black African Guyanese, West Bank Forum in the Baggersville Community Center on the 30th of March. Thanks, and you've been watching African Drums.